Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end, as we will hold a 30-minute networking session in the neural network. Here you can meet, ask questions to our distinguished speakers, connect, and chat with the AI for Good community. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to see you all here. My name is Matthias Greschel. I'm a physician scientist working with ITU, and I've been helping put together this AI and health series since now a little more than a year. I'm really honored to have Stevie Chancellor here with us today, and she's going to talk about human-centered AI for dangerous mental health behaviors online. And just the title, when I first read it, really enticed me to think about a lot of questions. And I'm just really curious and looking forward to hear Stevie talk today. This webinar series is co-hosted by the ITU WHO Focus Group on AI for Health and Harvard Medical School's Department of Biomedical Informatics. And if you want to know anything about what the ITU is doing with this focus group and standardizing AI for healthcare, please don't hesitate to reach out. Dr. Stevie Chancellor is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Minnesota. Prior to that, she received her PhD in human-centered computing from Georgia Tech and did a research fellowship at Northwestern University in Chicago. Stevie's research combines approaches from human-computer interaction and AI to build and then critically evaluate AI models and human-centered systems. Her focus in her research has been on high-risk health behaviors and mental health in online communities. Dear audience, before Stevie kicks off the talk, please ask your questions in the neural network. We'll make sure to put them forward to Stevie. I think this is a topic that really, provokes a lot of questions, so please feel free to ask anything that comes to your mind. And Stevie and I will be with you in the neural network at the hour. 1 hour from now to interact and chat with you all. All right, Stevie, so far for the introductions, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you. It's early morning in the Twin Cities, and so I'm really excited to chat with you about my research and some of the interesting implications of doing AI work for social good and mental health. I believe that you can see my screen now, and so I'm going to get started talking about some of my work and those implications that Matthias so graciously alluded to. But before I get started, I do have to warn all the audience members that because I work on pretty sensitive topics like suicidality, eating disorders, and self-injury, I will be discussing and talking about this content. Now, if you or a loved one has ever struggled with mental health or has gone through some of these experiences, you know that this can be difficult to talk about in some circumstances. And I like to pause here to warn us, just aware that we're going to be talking about some heavy stuff, but also to take a moment to reflect on how these issues impact us as not only very, very personally, but also as a society. And part of my work is motivated by trying to address these questions. So let's go ahead and start talking about mental health. And as I mentioned before, mental health is really, really challenging. It can be very isolating for people. Recent data from the United States has talked about or has found that people can wait on average a decade from the first onset of symptoms that they have about mental illness to actually receiving treatment, whether that be through a therapist or a psychiatrist who's able to dispense medication. On average, it takes people a decade to get assistance. And that means that they spend a decade alone and isolated, oftentimes struggling with feelings that may be very stigmatizing or shameful that they can't talk about this with. And a lot of social platforms have realized that there's this opportunity to find people in these moments of isolation to try and assist. Facebook has recently in the last couple of years, has deployed an algorithm that can predict whether someone may be suicidal on their platform. Now, when Facebook reported to NPR about the efficacy of this algorithm, they said that 10 or so people were picked up by the system every day that may be considering taking their own lives and were not otherwise reported to the platform. And that is, over the course of a year, about 3,600 people who would not have been reported or possibly reached out to by a friend. And I think that this is a really interesting opportunity for Facebook, where they can point to 3,600 people who may actually, their system may actually have saved their literal life. Now, Facebook doesn't release any information on how effective this system is at preventing suicide attempts. And just to be clear, measuring that is really, really difficult, even when you don't have Facebook as the intermediary. However, Facebook is trying in this opportunity to make a difference in the use of machine learning or AI for mental health. Now, it's not just Facebook and the feeds you get on places like Facebook or Twitter, right? Large communities of people are gathering together on places like YouTube and TikTok, Snapchat, and Reddit to talk about their mental health and to seek support for these really challenging and really stigmatizing mental disorders that they may be suffering from. For example, in r/depression, this is a community on the social media site Reddit. I took the screenshot this morning of people going to this community to try and find information about their depression and to seek assistance and support from others, as they may be in really, really dark places in their life. And I think that these examples, like those that exist for like Facebook and Reddit and other places, raise this question about how could we use this information to be able to better connect with people who are struggling and possibly assist them through social support, interventions, or other kind of assistance that may be mediated through these social platforms. And this brings up questions for me as a computer scientist, as well as someone who cares deeply about mental illness, because I also struggle with the mental illness myself. And it brings up questions like, could we identify and support people when they're struggling? Could we possibly intervene where people may not be able to have the financial or physical means to be able to get to a doctor to see that support? Can we actually save lives of people like this person on the bottom who says, I died a long time ago? Could we actually intervene and possibly make changes in their lives? Now, I think about doing this through AI systems. Now, I think that deploying systems like those on Facebook, or the ones that I build, have some really big consequences. And this is a huge elephant in the room for me, because as a computer scientist, I think a lot about what happens when we do things kind of, not in a way that is yet accurate. So some of the consequences of building these systems, there's a lot of risk to them. Things like bad models, bad scientific standards. If you're familiar with other kind of sciences, we can't yet draw causal conclusions from large-scale social media data. And as you may have been learning through the seminar series, there's also tons of risk for discrimination, fairness issues, and injustice that exist when we have bad models that do not actually predict mental illness, or they do so in ways that are biased. But I want to pause for a second, because I think it's important to reflect on where we are right now and what the world could look like in 10 or 15 years. As I mentioned, state of the art, we have pretty good performance, but it's not yet that outstanding. But let's think about what's going to look like in 10 years when things start getting towards 90 or 95% accurate, and social networks like Facebook start deploying more systems that may actually detect when people are not doing so great. I think that there's an interesting question here about what are the consequences of when we have good systems. There are still risks of good, even perfect prediction systems where you close your eyes and imagine that there's this oracle that can identify when you're doing well. Things that work well are going to push us to start reconsidering our role in diagnosing and treating mental illness. For example, what happens if it gets really, really good at identifying when people are suicidal? Who intervenes? What do we do when we need to make an intervention? Surely this is something we need to start thinking about. And so today I'm going to talk to you about this key question that I've been alluding to. of can we build AI systems that can predict mental illness that are both accurate as well as aware of these social consequences, and therefore, in my perspective, would be more ethical. Now, as Matthias mentioned to you before, I conceptualize my research in doing human-centered AI, and I've used this term a couple of times already. Now, I think a lot of time, I pulled this from a Stanford website, which has one of the most famous human AI research centers. I think that when we think of human-centered AI, we start thinking about people engaging with chatbots or robots. You see the smiling woman who's throwing a ball, and the guy in the background is the computer scientist. He's taking observations and watching what the robot does. But online trace data of behavior makes these relationships with the human here fuzzy and much more complex, because there's no smiling researcher in the background when Facebook evaluates if you may be struggling with your mental health. And so I think that interesting questions emerge about what obligations researchers have to the communities that they research and to the society that their work serves. And so I think that in this case, it's more than just building good systems that have high performance. For me, I think of human-centered AI as using computer science in service of pro-social goals to solve human problems. Now, this is more, like I said, than just humans working with scientists in lab settings, right? These systems have to be deployed without such oversight. And so it's more than just bringing humans into the loop, or having people annotate data, or having a scientist who cares a lot about mental health do it, but a fundamental shift in how we think about doing this work. And so in this talk, I'm going to talk to you about how I've started to incorporate human-centered perspectives into computer science approaches to build systems that can establish and evaluate people's well-being on social media websites. And so in this way, if you're a computer scientist and you're familiar with the area, this work intersects between human-computer interaction studies and machine learning. And I think that this relationship is mutually beneficial for both sides. Machine learning and AI benefit from deeply understanding communities and incorporating that back into their implementation by making their systems more robust. And people and communities benefit when machine learning aligns with their values, goals, and interests. So today in this talk, I'm going to talk to you about 3 pieces and 3 challenges that we face in this work. The first is this level of individual level predictions. And as you can see on the right, this onion diagram where we are slowly unpacking how AI intersects across these multiple layers of people's use of technology. So the first layer that I'm going to unpack is the individual level prediction and how we might go about making these guesses based on the trace data that people leave on social media websites. The second is that we'll talk more about how social platforms interact with dangerous mental health content like that about suicide, crisis, and self-injury, and what social networks do in response when they moderate and manage this content. Finally, I'll wrap up and talk more about the social impacts of when we start thinking from bad systems to good systems, like I mentioned earlier. What happens when we start to deploy and have these systems run by themselves? And what intervening ethical challenges pop up to make this work better? And so let's begin by talking about challenges with building these AI systems themselves. And I think that, for the people in the audience who are computer scientists, I'm going to be simplifying some of the science parts of this to make sure that everyone can understand this talk. But I'd love to connect with you in the neural network later or through questions about some of the more technical components of my work. So as we get into this, just be aware that I am I'm sort of describing this in a way that would be more accessible. So there's several big challenges that come in building systems for people with mental illness. How do we get great labels on so much data? So I want to pause here and realize that social media just doesn't have really, really good labeling strategies for going through and identifying people who may have mental illness, especially with those gaps in clinical diagnosis and care that I mentioned earlier. It's really hard to get good data. It's also really hard, even if you have great data, to transform that into a way that you can understand and that is consistent over time, because people's experiences with mental illness change. Lastly, it can be really challenging to be able to incorporate different kinds of data, text, images, video, sound, All of these require unique and distinctive skill sets in computer science that typically aren't held by a single person. We have experts in natural language processing, computer vision, video processing. And myself, I'm more experts in images and static text analysis. So there's a lot of challenges here. I'm going to walk you through how some of my work has sort of dealt with these issues, starting with the question of, well, where do we go and get data to make sure that we can identify these behaviors in ways that are clinically robust? So in some past work, I was able to identify patterns within the community of over 90 papers that were working, or 90 papers written by scientists that were working to use AI to make predictions about mental health and social media. Now, this research area has been active for about a decade at this point, and most of the standards for labeling data have kind of coalesced around these three strategies. Human assessment, where people like you or me or doctors or computer scientists go through and literally label the data. The second is community or network affiliations, where we use metadata from the post, like hashtags or communities that people are a part of, to then say, yes, this person uses a hashtag related to mental illness. Therefore, we're going to consider them part of our positively identified group of people who have it. We also use signals like self-disclosures of people who say that I'm anxious, or administering screeners or questionnaires to participants who consent to being studied. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we can take this data and be able to identify if somebody may have mental illness. However, even though there are these many methods, some of these methods are really challenging to adopt when you start thinking about the scale. So I'm going to take this example of the hashtags with hashtag and anxiety. And I want to ask the question here, when we use community signals like hashtags, what does it mean to have anxiety? Well, if you're familiar with anxiety at all, anxiety, the word, means tons of different things. It can be a symptom that influences other mental disorders, a transient emotion that people experience. Right now I'm a little anxious giving this talk. It can also refer to lay usage of people's emotional states or traits of a person, right? No, she's just a little anxious, don't worry about it. Finally, it's a category of nervous disorders, which includes diagnoses like generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, panic attacks, and other kinds of anxieties related to phobias or fears. Now, when somebody uses hashtag anxiety or hashtag anxious, it's not clear what these map to. And in the last slide, some of these assessments also have the same problem, where it can be really difficult to evaluate if somebody says, I'm really anxious right now, if that means we should use that data as a way to identify that somebody may actually be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, which I think can be really challenging. So in my head, one of the ways that we can move away from this is, instead of focusing on disorder as the category that we want to find, we can look at the severity of the posts that people are talking about right now to evaluate in the moment how people are feeling. So one of the strategies that I've come up with is being able to identify mental illness severity in the topics of posts that people post on social media websites. Now, a little bit about mental illness severity. This is a clinically grounded idea from our collaborators as well as the literature that evaluates the severity at a moment of somebody's mental illness. One of the nice things about mental illness severity is that it is disorder agnostic, meaning that we can consider the severity of someone's illness, whether it be depression, panic attack, OCD, or suicidality. And importantly, mental illness severity is something that therapists respond to in clinical practice. So when severity gets high, therapists may consider, wow, their mental illness is seeming pretty bad today. Maybe I should make an intervention by changing their medication dosages, changing the way that I interact with them in therapy. And so we were able to use the topics of conversation that come up in Instagram posts to develop a 3-tier evaluation for mental illness severity, which we then could apply very quickly across lots of data sets, because we were able to leverage the topics as the source of this information. And in a couple slides, I'll show you a couple examples of these topics to show you that this actually works really, really well. And we were able to identify these 3 levels of mental illness severity. High, which are actions or thoughts that indicate active harm or threat to a person. Medium mental illness severity, which is cognitive markers that may not encourage action, like thinking that you're worthless or talking about depression. And low mental illness severity, which is conversations on social media data or conversations in social media that are unrelated to mental illness, because most of our participants or most of our subjects in this data set also talk about things that are related to other content. Now, what I think is really cool, and that I mentioned to you before, is that we had a team of collaborators on this project to do the annotations of the topics and to verify that the topics that we were able to extract were actually clinically relevant. On the top, you see Stephanie and Erica are two domain experts. They both have clinical experience working with eating disorder and other patients with severe mental illness. And on the bottom is myself and my PhD advisor, Mahmounda Chowdhury, who are both computer scientists with domain expertise, but certainly do not have medical degrees. And I think this is a really good example of a human-centered approach to doing AI. We want the doctor's expertise to guide our design process for the algorithm and the outcome from the start. And we use their feedback at crucial stages of algorithm development to better understand the community and ensure that our annotation system of this is clinically relevant, especially because we're going to use the annotation system to automatically annotate posts about their severity from the text that they use. Now, I want to point out that this was done in 2015. So this kind of collaborative effort was much less common in the CS and AI space. And a lot of people have started doing the same things that we were, which is working with doctors actively from the start of the project to make sure that they have the information correct. And I'm really excited that that researchers are starting to work more closely with clinical experts in developing these systems. Now, I promised you earlier I'd show you some example annotations that we were able to build from the topic model using the clinical input. What we were able to do is, using the hashtags that appear on a post, we identify the topics that those hashtags are related to, and we can compute a weighted average of those topics' severity across the whole distribution of posts that are available. Here's the example post that I grabbed from the data set. The first one, which was rated 1, is somebody actually talking about their tattoos and their, and just so you know, I have blurred out most of the content of these images to protect the anonymity of the participants in this data set. Now, moving on from number 1, number 2, or medium MIS, was somebody who was discussing their depression and their concerns about and difficulties with struggling with depression. And behind them is a quote that talks about how when you've been in the dark for a really long time, you start to get really used to it. The third example is what we rated as a high mental illness severity, because this person was actively talking about restricting and binging behaviors, two very severe actions that people take when they struggle with anorexia or bulimia, common eating disorders. Now, when we take our annotation algorithm and we can apply it to 26 million posts, we can see the change in time of people's mental illness severity as a whole. And we can then look and understand what happens in these communities. Now, this slide shows mental illness severity over time. And this graph has 2 y-axes. So I'm going to explain this real quick so we're on the same page. On the left-hand side is the fraction of users who have medium or high mental illness severity. And you can see medium and high severity ratings with the blue and red lines respectively. On the right-hand side, we show the proportion of people who posts that have MIS level 1 or low severity, and that line is in green. Now, you might notice a couple things. One, over time, the fraction of users who were posting mental illness severity 1 or low severe, like not very severe content, was going down. And we showed that, and correspondingly, that the medium and high severity is going up. And we showed that over time, what ended up happening was that there was about a 13% increase year over year in medium and high severity content on Instagram in this data set. But we also noticed this kind of precipitous drop later in the data set. And that is 50 months after we started data collection. Now, a little context about what's going on here. Instagram is starting to experiment with content moderation related to severe mental illness and eating disorders. For the time that we're looking at, it's possible that the moderation decision that they made here was actually impacting the content that was happening on the site. More on that in a bit. However, one of the limitations of this data is that it's not causal. And so even if I could go in and extract a moment in time of which Instagram moderates something, I can't use this data set to make the assumption that a moderation decision may actually impact the community. However, we do have some work about that I'll talk about in a few to explore the impacts of moderation on what may be causing this bump in the data set. Now, in addition to coming up with strategies for labeling, another big issue or challenge when we're thinking about AI for predicting mental illness is how we model these problems. And as I mentioned earlier, time and multimodality of data are really important when building models that can work really well. So in other work, we've modeled recovery timelines, where we look at the use of Tumblr, a microblogging website that was, I guess, a little more popular about 10 years ago, to understand how people shift their behavior from talking about eating disorders actively to moving in recovery. We used a survival analysis here of the content that people posted, as well as the information that they provided about themselves, to predict when people might shift to recovery. And we found that this shift in people's posts and timelines happened about 48 months after they joined the community, or about 4 years. Now, I think that this is interesting in comparison to what we know about people seeking out treatment in person, right? I mentioned earlier that the median onset of treatment for people with mental illness is about 10 years. This is about half of it. I don't want to say that that's good. 5 years is still a really long time to be able to receive treatment for severe mental illness like an eating disorder. And this has pointed us to new directions on how we can identify and possibly come up with strategies to shorten the time to reaching or engaging with the recovery community on Tumblr. We also have done some work on different kinds of data, on text and images. Now, this is an architecture diagram from a project that I did working with Tumblr directly while I was an intern in 2017 to identify content that may violate the community guidelines on eating disorder content. And this specific architecture incorporates both hashtags and text in a post, as well as the images itself, which is something that very few studies and very few researchers have started doing. But it's really important though, because a lot of information is conveyed through text. And if you've ever used TikTok or seen your kids use TikTok, comes through in video as well. And so for me, the takeaways on this is that we have had major progress over the last decade in working on identifying and labeling the data, as I mentioned earlier, building models, and using new modalities of data to make sure that we are accurately representing the concepts that we want about mental illness in our AI modeling problems. But there is still much left to do. The best state-of-the-art performance that we're getting across well-validated models is in the 80 to 85% accuracy range. Said another way, that means that 1 in 5 posts related to mental illness in these data sets are labeled wrong, which means that we have a lot of work to do about performance, incorporating new modalities of data, reporting on our standards, and making sure that our models work for over time or as the concept stripped. And so there's a lot of opportunity for us to make our models even better. Now, I want to move on here to thinking about not only the computer science, building and engineering these models, which I do spend a lot of time on, but thinking about how these models and decisions impact social platforms a little broadly. And so I want to talk about moderation and how it intersects with severe mental illness or dangerous behaviors, like the ones that we've been talking about. Now, taking a step back from our onion diagram earlier, we've talked about how individual prediction happens to a unique person. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about platform effects and how platforms engage with this content and think about these issues. Now, if you've been paying any attention in the news recently, you know that content moderation is a huge challenge for social networks like Facebook and Twitter. Platforms have really, really complicated relationships with mental illness and the support that these communities provide to their members. especially for dangerous mental health content, which unfortunately we have evidence that it can be quote unquote contagious to others. As in, if you see stuff that is pretty severe and you also are struggling with mental illness, you might actually be negatively impacted by seeing that kind of content. On the right-hand side, I've included different kind of ban or content moderation efforts that different social networks have used in the past and in present to deal with this severe mental illness content. This includes interstitial, basically like little pop-ups like you see on the left on Instagram that asks if you want to get support, all the way from banning content like pro-eating disorder communities and violating community guidelines on Tumblr. And so one of the things I want to know sometimes is, does this actually help people? Does it decrease the severity of content and reduce the risk of contagious content spreading to people who are also dealing with severe mental illness? So as I mentioned earlier, we did a study on Instagram trying to figure out if Instagram's content moderation strategies were effective at actually stopping the spread of pro-eating disorder content on its platform. A little history here. In 2014, Instagram banned about 10 hashtags that were getting a lot of press attention because they had a lot of content that had eating disorder content that actively promoted eating disorders. Now, when I say promoted, I mean that it encouraged eating disorders as a lifestyle choice and shared dangerously low-calorie diets, tips on staying skinny or hiding your binging behaviors from your parents, encouragement with very thin, emaciated models, stuff that's actually pretty severe and worrisome. Instagram banned the hashtags that formed the communities of these. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see what happens when you search for the hashtag thigh gap, the gap between your thighs, or what people sometimes use to measure their adherence to an anorexic lifestyle. Now, when you search hashtag thigh gap after the ban, it would pop up that no hashtags were found or no posts were found. Same thing or a different thing would happen on the right for other hashtags called ANA, A-N-A, or short for anorexia. You'd get these content advisory interstitials that I mentioned that encourage people to go through support, but then would let them see the posts anyways. So Instagram implemented these bans on about 10 to 15 hashtags in 2014. And we were able to develop an algorithm to identify what happened when these hashtags were banned. So let me walk you through what we saw happen on the website. This is hashtag thigh gap that I mentioned earlier. We were able to gather 8 million public posts related to eating disorders more broadly that used some of these hashtags. Hashtag thigh gap gets banned in 2014. What I can tell you happened using our algorithm is that these alternative spellings to the original hashtag popped up. Thigh gap with 2 P's, or thigh gap with a Y instead of an I in thigh. Same thing happens. Instagram gets Y's to thigh gap with 2 P's and bans it, and a new variant pops up. They leave thigh gap with a Y, and other modifications pop up as well. Over 8 million posts, we were able to identify over 300 of these variants from the original hashtags. And what we found was that these variants were where people started migrating after Instagram banned the original hashtag thigh gap. Now, to be clear, in some cases, Instagram was able to reduce the number and rate of posting on the original hashtags and their variants. However, some hashtags really picked up, especially those with those content advisories like Anna after the content was banned from original hashtags like thigh gap. And what was even more concerning is that we could come up with this lexical variation strategy to predict how people were going to respond to the banning strategies that were going on. And we showed that the content on the lexical variants that popped up got more dangerous. Specifically, it received more likes and comments because the community kind of doubled down on posting, and the content that was shared on these lexical variants were more severe. You remember how I mentioned earlier the MIS level 3 or the severe content? Yeah, that got way worse on the variants. And so the in our evaluation of whether moderation helps in this case or not, I actually don't think that the pro-ED ban was very successful at stopping the post about these topics or in reducing the severity of this content. Now, I actually was able to talk to some engineers at Instagram about dealing with this when this paper came out. And one of the things that they noted to me is the difficulty in actually doing moderation on this work. This content can be, quite frankly, kind of disturbing, and it can be hard to identify which of the lexical variants are going to pop up that they need to then enact moderation on, which I understand. Content moderation right now is incredibly difficult at scale because my data set had 8 million posts, and it's impossible to expect humans to go through 8 million posts and individually evaluate them. But what I think is really interesting about these patterns is that we're seeing the same thing pop up on TikTok. So this is something that platforms and people keep doing, and users are smarter than ever at avoiding this. On the left-hand side, you can see Thinspo, or THNSPO. Now, Thinspo is short for thin inspiration, and is something that people engage with when they are trying to maintain their eating disorders. On the right-hand side, however, is hashtag unalive awareness. This is a hashtag that has come to prominence on TikTok because TikTok aggressively removes anybody who says the word suicide or suicidal. If you're talking about it from a recovery or healthy perspective, all the way to people who may be talking about their own suicidal crisis in the moment, it all gets taken off of TikTok. And users have responded to this by talking about unaliving, or the act of taking your own life into your own hands. And it's really hard to evaluate what we should do when it comes to applying standards, like I had mentioned before, about banning hashtags that avoid the content moderation platforms. On one hand, hashtag Thinspo is something related to severe eating disorder content and breaks TikTok's guidelines pretty clearly. And we could argue that this content is pretty contagious and hurts people when they see it. However, unalive awareness often is people talking about their experiences with suicide and suicide prevention. And it's really hard for me to argue that banning suicidal conversation about suicide in relationship to prevention is a good thing for TikTok to do. Now, I want to pause here and talk again about the challenges of moderating this kind of content by using humans or AI. Facebook and other content platforms have actually worked on building automated systems that can identify when people are posting stuff that can be really dangerous for other people to watch, especially graphic videos of suicide as they spread across platforms. And there's been really interesting conversations and questions about why moderators didn't take down these live streams. Quite frankly, I bet it's because they didn't catch it. Nobody reported it, and it takes about 24 to 48 hours at the fastest for content to be reviewed by social networks. And in some cases, like on sites that don't have nearly the human capital that Facebook has behind its moderation, it can take weeks to review content. And so these articles that came out about a live streamed suicide, I think underscore the difficulty in building moderation systems, either automated or by humans, about what to do in these scenarios. And that's where I'd like to end this talk, is talking about the social impacts of human-centered AI for mental health. Now, I've talked a lot about building the systems and how platforms respond. Let's go back to this thought experiment that I posed at the beginning of this talk. Let's close our eyes and think, all right, we have an automatic system that can identify when somebody is posting a live stream video for suicide. I think that there's really challenging questions when we get to this outside layer of the onion about what we should do in these circumstances and about how privacy intersects with our right to talk about our mental health experiences and who is responsible for intervening if somebody is actively in crisis. And there's a lot of ethical implications that come up in this role, right, or in this work. So things like doctor-patient relationships and obligations to intervene. Things like privacy and the role of society in our expectations and interventions. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples of how difficult it is for us to know how to intervene and how AI systems in the past have not done intervention so well. And I'll leave us on a couple questions for us to talk about and think about as we envision a world where these AI systems may be more accurate and performant and maybe something that get more widely deployed in practice. So on the next slide, just so you know, I'm going to show you a post of somebody who's struggling with eating disorders. So if you want to listen to me as I talk, you can do that, or you can choose to look away. This graphic can be kind of disturbing if you ever struggled with eating disorders. This person has posted to Instagram. And this kind of post happened a lot in the data sets that I mentioned to you before, where I'm thinking about eating disorders. This person is wrapping their hands around their thighs and using that to measure their progress towards maintaining their eating disorder. And they're talking about how stressed out they are about a lot of other stuff that's going on related to prom and their body. Now, I want to pause for a second and let's consider this. You're scrolling through social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, and you see this. What would you do? So here's what you might do. And when I do this in person, I actually will call in the audience of people who will say what they could do. Now, you may find a person and you may like the post or post a supportive comment. You may say, wow, you look great. You don't need to worry about your body. Or, oh my God, I also struggle with my body image too. Now, you may not decide to reach out to the person. Maybe instead you report this post to Instagram or to Twitter. You may reach out in private and DM them and ask them how they're doing and if they want any social support. But honestly, I think most of us had this uncomfortable realization with this exercise, in that most of us actually probably would keep scrolling because we don't know what to do when we see severe or dangerous mental illness behaviors come up on social media. And I want to be clear that all of these are valid options of what to do, because frankly, we're not taught of what to do when we see somebody struggling with their mental illness, nor what we should do that might actually help people. And so I want to return to the Facebook suicide prevention AI that I mentioned earlier as one way to address these concerns. So when Facebook deploys its AI and it identifies someone who may be in crisis, what they do is they actually refer it to a moderator who then goes and looks at the content and then can choose from a suite of options what to do, including removing somebody's account, removing a post, or possibly sending the authorities if they believe that this person is a threat to other people. Now, this is an interesting example of how Facebook has come up with a strategy for what it does when it uses automated systems to identify suicide crisis, as well as other dangerous health behaviors like the ones I've described before. I want to juxtapose what Facebook has done with a more person-centered approach that was deployed in the early 2010s called Samaritan's Radar. Now, this is a screenshot from Samaritan's Radar app. This was deployed by a charity in the UK that tried to leverage one of the most effective suicide prevention techniques with an app, which is social support from friends. There's tons of evidence that shows that when we leverage and we reach out to people when they're struggling, it actually decreases the likelihood, their own severity of mental illness, and the likelihood that they'll seek professional help. So Samaritan's Radar tried to leverage this by looking through your Twitter contacts to see if somebody had posted something that indicated that they were in crisis. The radar would then alert you as the owner of the app saying, this tweet was spotted by the radar, are you worried about this? Now, in this example, this person is talking about wanting to die, and this person seems to be in suicide crisis. But one of the challenges with this app, and the reason it got taken down from the App Store in about 5 days, was because people used it without consent. They went through social media data, and if I was the owner of the app, it went through all of my friends' social media data and then evaluated how they were doing without asking them. Further, people were actually using the radar to harass and bully others. They would tune the radar to have a very, very high response rate and say, I want to reach out to all my friends when they're struggling, and use that to harass and bully people. And the people who were being harassed had no choice in whether or not they were included in the radar's surveillance of their behavior. Now, I don't know, if I'm being honest, what the meaningful differences are between intervening like this with social support on Twitter to what Facebook does behind the scenes, and how that impacts how we intervene with people in social media data. And I think these two examples clearly delineate some of the data privacy issues that come at stake, and how people's expectations of access to their data and engagement with algorithmic systems should impact what those systems can do with our data and who and how it interacts with that content and makes suggestions for what to do. And I want to be clear that this not only intersects with privacy laws like GDPR and other protections that exist around the globe, but also the social expectations of how to handle these behaviors. And I'll end this talk on something that came up in the news recently that I think is really, that captures the spirit of this privacy information. If you're an expert or in the mental health space in general, you might have heard about how an American service called Crisis Text Line was sharing its data about crisis text. So Crisis Text Line is one of the oldest text-based crisis support systems in the US. You text a number and you are directly connected with somebody who's a trained counselor to help you through crisis. Crisis Text Line founded a spinoff for, this is important, Crisis Text Line is a nonprofit. They founded a for-profit spinoff and we're sharing the data from the crisis conversations of people in mental health crisis with their for-profit spinoff to improve customer service chats, to help de-escalate customer service chats. Now, the translation of crisis text to customer service notwithstanding, I think that this Crisis Text Line example of using data from a nonprofit service about mental health and crisis for a for-profit company raises a lot of issues that we were talking about before, about consent, data privacy and protection, and what is appropriate to do with the data and the traces that people leave while they're struggling. And this touches back on some of these communities and these ideas that I talked about earlier. We don't really have great social strategies for knowing what's appropriate to do with this data, or what we should do if our AI systems alert us that somebody may be in crisis. So I want to conclude this talk by thinking about what are some of the opportunities and unanswered questions, what's next. And if you have questions or want to talk about these are some of the big questions that I think are really interesting and fun to consider. The first is thinking about what the requirements are for more performant AI systems. If we take this as a purely engineering question and we ignore all the complex social questions, what level of performance is acceptable to us to deploy a system without human intervention or with limited human intervention? Is it 90% accuracy, 95, 99? We use medical tests sometimes that had 80 to 85% specificity and sensitivity, but those are often evaluated by doctors, not just running by themselves and possibly flagging people's accounts or removing their only social source of social support. The second question I want to reflect on is who should we bring into these processes to decide what we do with more performant algorithms? Doctors, community members, admins, and moderation staff? Who else should be included in these conversations? The work that I've talked to you about today has focused mostly on my work with doctors, and I'm starting to think about how we can bring in community members to these research studies and evaluations to know how they feel about how their data is being used by social networks. And I think that there's some interesting questions that kind of connect to each other about policy solutions that might protect people, privacy preservation of this data and not taking it out of the context that it exists in. And the big question that I have is, okay, so just because we can design this technology, should we design this compassionate and privacy preserving interventions at all? We could come up with laws and regulation, guidelines and principles for doing this more compassionately and ethically. But at some point, we'll have to reconcile with and understand and make decisions about in what circumstances is deploying AI for mental health appropriate, and what do we as a society not want us to consider. And I'm really excited for us to solve some of these challenges and see how to apply this work to other cases where these social consequences of errors and impacts and interventions are much higher. So I want to thank you so much for listening to this talk. I'll leave these questions up now, as well as some contact information. And as Matthias mentioned, I'll hang around the neural network for a bit after we're finished. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stevie. That was really fantastic. Imagine a huge round of applause for that really cool talk. I want to encourage the audience. Now is a good time to ask your questions. We have about 10 minutes of live discussion. And there's a couple of questions coming in. Please ask short questions to make it easier for me to rephrase them and put them forward. And I want to start with a question that has been sort of grabbing my mind from your first slide on, which is thinking about how AI has been used to predict crime and how it's reinforcing existing bias. Are you worried about the same happening with your models, that essentially your data set will be biased by, some regions that may not have any psychosocial and mental health support, and thus people don't talk so much about it? These types of biases will impact your predictions, and you reinforce these biases with your models.
Yeah, so quick question before I answer. Should I stop screen sharing so you and I can talk?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. All right, awesome. Now we can both see the two of us. So the answer is yes. So absolutely, bias is going to happen in models. So I am a native English speaker. I work primarily on English-speaking social websites. And that means that all of the bias that comes with signaling mental distress is going to occur only in English. I can't apply it to other languages. But thinking differently about how we consider bias, one of the challenges in working with the data sets that I do is that there is inherent bias to who uses social networks to be able to access support. So on Reddit, the population leans distinctively more male and slightly older than a platform like Instagram, which leans more women and females use that, and leans younger for teens and young adults. And so the platform that you pick is going to have these inherent biases, which is why I'm very nervous to say that you could use a model that you build on Instagram data and just plunk it on top of TikTok or Reddit, because you will have built in the bias of who is on the site and what data is available to you, notwithstanding like the fact that there's just troves of people who do not use these systems. And so the question of non-use in this is really, I think, can limit the expansiveness of their application. But given the lack of mental health care in many contexts, I think personally the benefits from the bias perspective outweigh the costs, as long as you are conservative about how you apply that work.
Okay. So Anna Keeler had a question. When you introduced that clinically validated score of the severity of mental anxiety and illness, I'm just wondering, in these models, do you control for mental freshness and memory capacity, such as the number of errors in the written texts?
Yeah, so that's a really good question about some of the data. And so in my models, I don't, but I can tell you a little bit about what other experts in the area do. People do factor into account the readability as well as the understandability of the text in evaluating somebody's change in their mental illness, as well as using that for diagnostic criteria in comparison with what we would consider like non-diagnosed controls. So other work, especially focused on schizophrenia, has considered these measures that might relate to clarity of language as well as errors in text. So yes, it's something that other folks factor in.
Okay. So I was wondering, you were mentioning that one of the limits is having good labels on your fairly big data sets.
Yep.
Have you thought about running a sort of a case control study retrospectively, where you recruit individuals with mental disorders and sort of matched controls, and you get your hands on their social media posts like 1 or 2 years prior to the event? And that would allow you to kind of quantify the effect of social media presence and the type of posts on mental illness.
Yeah, so there has been some work by some of my colleagues at Georgia Tech doing this match control study. One of the challenges in doing this work is that it shows that people are thinking about different and talking about different things. So her work was focused on schizophrenia. She had people who had been admitted to the hospital for psychosis related to schizophrenia. And she found that people who then also said online that they have schizophrenia have totally different posting patterns and have different language patterns in their data set. Now, I want to be clear that just because the people online who say that they have schizophrenia don't match patients' patterns doesn't invalidate the people that we don't have in our study, right? These people may have a diagnosis, but use their social media in wildly different ways. And so the other problem with this study too was that it's hard to evaluate if you don't have a patient when their mental illness may be more severe and requiring hospitalization versus when it goes into remission, because most people's illnesses change over the course of their life. So I would love to do more matched control studies that actually try and grapple with these two challenges, which is that when we look at data on social media, they just look very different than the patients that we interact with.
Okay. Yeah. So Ushnish Sengupta has a question. He's asking, should we be holding nonprofits like Crisis Text Line to a different standard of data governance than other corporations that use and work with data?
So I'll be clear that I have pretty strong opinions about this, and that I was very disappointed with Crisis Text Line handling of data, especially because they espouse themselves as a nonprofit or a not-for-profit. I get them confused, but that they are doing this out of the goodness of their heart, to the point where they were trying to get the text, I think it's 999 in the US, to directly connect to Crisis Text Line if you texted that. And they were trying to have this kind of enshrined in like actual federal law. Given that they are trying to position themselves as this really valuable crisis service, yes, I do think that they have different standards than corporations like Facebook. That being said, I don't think we hold Facebook to as stringent of standards as we should when it comes to protecting people's privacy, maintaining a healthy atmosphere, and considering the impacts of how content sharing can impact people with severe mental illness. So can we increase our scrutiny of both of these? Absolutely, but I think Crisis Text Line needs additional scrutiny that even Facebook would not get in the best of circumstances.
I was also wondering, are you actively collaborating with some of these tech companies, trying to help them improve their sort of filters and moderation patterns?
I have worked with them, and I can't tell you which ones, unfortunately, because of corporate rules, but I have been working with tech companies to try and improve these systems, especially for the content moderation strategies that remove very, very valuable communities that provide support to people in recovery. Recovery is something that's really stigmatized and embarrassing. People don't like to admit that they have an addiction or an eating disorder or severe mental illness, and that can be really isolating. And I think that a lot of companies get overly aggressive on removing that content. Like I mentioned, the unalive awareness hashtag on TikTok is a good example of how I think they've gotten a little overzealous.
Okay. Can you maybe, we're almost at the hour now, but can you maybe give us sort of an outlook, like 10 years from now? How do you hope that your research will transform and improve the way that social media is handling dangerous behavior in online communities?
Yeah. So I will say that on a given day, I probably am a very cautious optimist that you could use AI tools like the ones I build to help people, broadly speaking. Now, for me, my outlook is that you think about you royally, being the company or the system or whoever is deploying this technology, think really critically about how they're deploying this to help, how we make sure that this aligns with social expectations of what we know and think about mental illness care, and that we don't inadvertently cause lots of harm to communities that are in really vulnerable positions. And so in 10 years, I hope that more AI and machine learning researchers think about the human side of the predictions that they make in these really complicated, sort of really sticky situations that have really hard ethical outcomes, and that machine learning and AI talk more to folks who are doctors and researchers in non-technical fields and the users themselves about what we want and what they want.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Stevie. That was really a fantastic talk and a wonderful example of what you just alluded to, that computer scientists really take this human-centered approach, and it's not about the model, it's about what happens after predictions. And that it really requires a whole bunch of people from different disciplines to really make sense of it. I'm sure the audience really loved your talk, and there's a lot of people with questions in the neural network, where Stevie and I will log in now. So please stick around and ask your questions. I just want to point to our next and last AI and Health webinar next week by Marcia Gastemi from who's at MIT in Cambridge. And she's going to talk about explainability of AI models next week, Tuesday. And then we're on a summer break for the month of August. And then we'll see you again in September. So thanks again to Stevie. Thanks to the AI for Good team and the co-convener Switzerland of AI for Good for hosting us. And yeah, looking forward to chatting with you all in the neural network. Have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. After the networking session, we invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.